Beyond the Yellow Brick Road, written and read by Tom Weston. There are two things most people from urban or city life are likely to never fully comprehend about farm life, such as how illuminated the night is without all the light pollution of civilization. When your home sits surrounded amidst acres of solitude, the sky is a spatial wonderland with only the limitations of your eye restricting how much of the universe you can see. The other, more down-to-earth acceptance is how easily a rickety farmhouse looking to collapse at so much as a sneeze could serve as home. But hey, there's no place like it. The two-story but compact structure was a wooden marvel, from its panel siding to window and door frames to the shingles on top. Most of it looked in need of repair, but it had held up through drought, depression, and even a terrible twister not so long ago. Mr. and Mrs. Blue had made a good life here with their niece, and when times were good, they had been able to bring on farmhands who were especially helpful to the couple who were getting on in years. They'd almost lost everything in that not-so-long-ago storm, but more, they'd almost lost the closest thing they'd ever known to a daughter. While they'd made it to the cellar, the poor dear took refuge inside the house and must have been pulled clean out, because they had found her out yonder in the pasture amidst strewn debris. The girl was fine, physically, but something had rattled her mentally and emotionally. She spoke of a delusion fitting for a drug trip, but nowhere near as enjoyable as the junky vagrants would make you believe with their addictive natures. No, she had been disturbed. She kept to the barn now, most days, often citing that she's getting ready and preparing and making an awful lot of noise in there. That racket isn't just from whatever she's working on, mind you, but she has something in there with her, something terrible sounding. And it must be big, 'cause Lord, it eats as much as a lion. In fact, despite this, the only peculiar thing their niece had directly asked of them was to take any and all mirror or reflective surface out of the house. On this particular evening, mostly quiet except from the sounds from the barn, Henry sat in his rocker on the front porch. He enjoyed the lemonade his dear sweet Emily had made for them, and they looked out upon their front lawn where his tractor was parked, and propped against it were nearly a dozen such looking glasses. They were unprepared for the deafening noise that came without warning. It could have been a ship blowing its foghorn if there had been any water around for it to sail upon. Instead, it seemed to bellow from the very heavens above, a second time now, almost like a warning or alarm. This time, it was accompanied by a green light what looked like it had been shone through water with how it glimmered over the land. An eye from the crack in the barn doors had come to see, and knew this shade of green all too well. Not green, she thought. Emerald. A third and final blaring, again, with a blanket of undulating viridescence to follow, except now the mirrors blasted out illuminated rays of green like they were intense spotlights. But they were not just lights, no, but doorways. And things had begun coming through them. These things were little and cheery in a most foul way, though perhaps it was simply due to how horrendous they looked. Standing, those that did, most were hunched or doubled over as they moved in slow jerky motions. They were generally 3 to 4 feet in height. One had a bulbous head from which unnatural horns looking like tree roots had sprouted. He was free of clothing except for the thin straps of leather barely covering his shame. Another had shriveled skin as if he had been dried in the sun too long. Though he had no legs, he sped along the earth in an army crawl fashion. In fact, he even wore a helmet of sorts. It was the preserved top portion of a much larger man's head, but it strapped below his chin like proper issue headgear. Maybe 20 or so of these pint-sized fellas had emptied out of the emerald glow of the mirrors and into the yard now. They stood at the ready until 2 taller gentlemen came through. The first was the sort of tormented horror of which you felt sorry for. The corpse of a young man had a pitchfork impaled upwards through his back and head, with a generous portion of rotting brain dangling on the prongs just above his damaged scalp. It looked as if wherever his flesh had decomposed enough to tear open, it had been filled with straw and sewn over. Most of his face had been replaced with a burlap sack on which a button made for his eye and dried corn for a toothy smile. He had something of a bounce in every other step, the one that had the pole of the pitchfork touch ground the same time as his foot. In his tattered farm clothes of flannel shirt and denim overalls, this gave him the grim countenance of a ghoulish scarecrow, one more than capable of scaring well beyond fine feathered friends. The other man was rather an automaton. He was tall, at least 7 feet, with a midsection like a repurposed antique wood-burning stove, the potbelly kind you'd find now in flea shops to use as decor. His legs seemed little more than worn-down railroad steel, fitted with the same sort of pistons, rods, and crank pins you'd see on a train's engine wheels to grant it, and this man, locomotion. One arm was made of an old subsoiler, or ripper, the type of anchor-looking piece of equipment to pull behind your tractor to loosen the hard-packed soil. His other arm, however, looked human, muscular and maybe a bit deformed, but human all the same, though with the axe it held, it looked just as deadly. His face, though likely a soft and malleable metal, could nearly have been silver-painted porcelain beneath his funnel cap. His features were soft and smooth and unmatched to the rest of his form. But then he opened his mouth, or more like a hinged bottom jaw rattled and showed sharp, rusty spikes for teeth.
"When are you gonna come down?"
This hellish tin man spoke to the bedroom window of the shack home's second floor. He thought the girl was in there, and when he got no response, it was then that he brought his gaze down to the elderly couple very nearly frozen on the front porch. When they snapped out of their daze, they hurried inside, and you could hear the door locking and latched behind them. The Tin Man outstretched his human arm and pointed to the home with his axe, and this sent his twisted munchkins into a frenzy. They raced towards it and made every effort to get in at the windows and the door, even clashing at the very walls themselves. The Tin Man spoke again, and just like before, his voice, hollow and inhuman, echoed upward from the pit of heartless nothingness within him.
"You should have stayed on the farm. You should have listened to your Aunt Em."
He threatened the girl who had come to his land, his home, and upset the balance of things there before running back to her own land to hide. A munchkin was kicked aside and chop! The axe crunched into the door with such force that only another swing or two would be needed to bring it down.
"You know you can't hold up forever. Your heart will soon be mine, too."
The Tin Man taunted his threats. Chop! One more should do it. He could hear Aunt Em crying and Uncle Henry trying to console her.
"Your screams, how they'll sound to me like singing."
Before the final swing, the two big barn doors burst open, and a guttural roar silenced the land, and all were motionless. All but the woman who exited. Dorothy Gale had not found the world of Oz to be wonderful. It had, in fact, been anything but, and it had changed her. She knew they would come, and she had spent her time preparing. She knew they'd use the princess, Ozma's, tricks with the mirrors. She knew she would need a bit of Oz itself to fight back, too. Her hair was still long and flowing, but was filthy and a brown dark enough to almost be black. It also sported premature streaks of gray as if it were a new style. She wore a simple, short-sleeved black shirt, unbuttoned almost dangerously low from the hot work environment of the barn. A dirty black and white plaid skirt which flashed a fair bit of thigh skin between this and the knee-high boots. These were buckled and laced, black except for the closed-toed portion, which were sparkling red. She had turned the ruby-red slippers into something more. And the platform heel, which wasn't a heel at all. Dorothy's pride and joy were her new footwear. Each heel was the barrel of a 20-gauge shotgun, the short and length variety that had a pistol grip, though she had no need for that here. They were buckled to her calves via her boots, and a tension wire ran from the trigger to her belt. This gave her all the movement of running, jumping, or even shooting behind herself, all with the trigger finger ready at her waistline. After all, at this moment, she needed her hands free to carry the heavy chain of her beastly familiar. The cowardly lion had been conditioned to fear nothing but Dorothy, and so he served her completely and obediently. He stands on his hind legs and looks more man turned lion than natural creature, and he's huge, giving even the Tin Man a run for his money in height. His body fur and mane both have been generously cared for and brushed to the point that he looks ready to contend in the county fair. A well-worn horse blanket has been fashioned like a loincloth to lend him some kind of modesty.
Well, hey, Dandy!
The Scarecrow greets his old friend, but the feelings are no longer mutual. The chain goes slack and is let go, and so too does the lion let loose. 3 immense bounds and he's to the Scarecrow, his mighty jaws clamped around the rotting mass of body, and the lion whips his head to and fro. This sends a limb flying, a leg perhaps, and then the Scarecrow is pressed against the soil, and massive claws rend him to shreds. All the while, the thing doesn't have enough brains to realize what's happening, and opposed to shrieking in pain, he only chuckles until his head is freed from his corpse body. Dorothy takes on a handful of munchkins who dared to charge her. Her right leg pops out in a front kick, the wire is pulled at her waist, and the horrid little thing is a pulpy mess of gore. Her left leg stretches to the side as she pivots, pulls the wire, and boom! She takes the recoil like a champ. Dorothy now brings one foot over to the pump action and uses it to skillfully eject the spent shell and load the next, first with one leg, then the other. She'd been readying herself for this, and the reload motion is quick and smooth. Another little creep is dispatched, and a fourth. She reloads and sees her brave lion leap from one halfling to the next, crushing one with his weight alone, devouring the head cleanly of the other. The Tin Man is upon her now, and he speaks.
Your heart has always seemed so strong. It will beat for me.
She sidesteps the attack with his artificial arm and goes into a backbend worthy enough to make a ballerina proud. Her foot, armed and dangerous, cradled in the socket of his shoulder, his human-armed shoulder, and blam! Quite literally, the last physical piece of Tin Man's humanity is blown away, blasted and severed from his mechanical body. He howls and tips over, falling to the ground as if he had become unbalanced and too heavy to withstand his own mass. A short distance away, the lion has made quick work of the remaining munchkins. He plods halfway toward Dorothy, stops and sits, and takes to cleaning himself, licking the blood in his fur and claws. Rolling on his back, his clawed arm clutching at the dirt, the Tin Man doesn't even register the feeling of Dorothy's boot slipper on his chest. Instead, he looks up at her, mercury blood seeping from his mouth as he tells her,
They'll simply get a replacement. There's plenty like me to be found. You'll never escape the influence of Oz.
Dorothy's foot lifts and hovers. It slowly creeps beyond his chest and over his face, that soft and malleable metal, almost porcelain-like with its features. His bottom jaw becomes agape and he screams. The Tin Man screams so profusely, steam jets from his funnel cap. Before the shot obliterates his face, Dorothy speaks to him at last, and it's upon her final word that she rips back the tension wire to fire the heel gun. Oh, I'm not worried. I've finally decided my future lies beyond the yellow brick road.